this week we are going to be talking about chapters 11 and 12. So this first lecture video is going to go over chapter 11, in which we're going to be talking about the development of strength and flexibility. The second will be covering chapter 12, in which we're looking more along the lines of kind of overall fitness and motor competence. To start off our discussion, we're going to go over muscle mass and strength first. Now these two terms are kind of key to our discussion on the development of strength, so we're going to talk about their definitions. Okay? Now, I find that this first concept we're going to talk about is very confusing for most students, so I'm going to try to explain it the best way that I can, because I think there are very logical things that you will start to think about in terms of how these terms are related, but they don't go hand in hand throughout the entire lifespan. So, muscle mass, we've talked about before, so this is a little bit of a review. But muscle mass, we usually talk about in terms of a sigmoid growth pattern, or it follows a sigmoid growth pattern, which generally is the same as our physical growth characteristics such as height and weight, right? So, muscle mass, as we kind of stretch out our bodies, our muscle fibers will increase their diameter. So we've got that hypertrophy effect in our muscle cells. Okay, so they're increasing in diameter. And generally there are minimal sex differences until puberty. And then we notice a bigger split between males and females after we hit puberty. Right, and that's because typically we have these hormonal changes, and then there's relatively not a whole lot of changes overall through adulthood up to about age 50, and then you have, women going through menopause between 50 and 60. We have both males and females kind of decreasing their overall physical activity typically around these older ages, which is going to cause a rapid decline in muscle mass. So that's muscle mass, okay? How much does your overall body tissue or muscular tissue weigh, right? Then we can talk about muscle strength, which is a person's ability to exert force, okay? Usually people will say, oh, if you have more muscle mass, you should have muscle strength, which is true. Right? The more your muscle weighs, likely the more that you're going to be able to produce something, right? If we looked at like two kids and we say their relative, free fat, their relative lean body mass is about the same. Generally, you would say, oh, well, they should both be able to produce about the same muscle strength. And this is true for a part of the lifespan, specifically in childhood, but it is not true for the rest of the lifespan, okay? So, reasons being is that muscle strength is dependent on a couple of factors, okay? So, again, strength is our ability to exert force. We know that our muscle tissue would not be able to be activated unless it had a nervous supply. Two things that we can look at in terms of the number of innervated muscle fibers. One is the cross-sectional area, so how many total fibers given a single muscle, right? So if we took our bicep, for example, and we put it on a table, we took it out of our arm and put it on a table, and then we cut it in half, right down the middle, right, at the largest part of the muscle belly, that would be the muscle's cross-sectional area. Okay, and we know that there are two different types of muscle growth. There is hypertrophy, in which we are increasing the size of a single fiber, but there's also hyperplasia, in which we can add cells or add more muscle fibers. Both of those things would contribute to an increased cross-sectional area, and the greater cross-sectional area that we have, generally the more muscle strength that we can produce, or the more force that we can produce. But this also is dependent, right? If we have bigger cells or we add more cells, that is nothing, right, if we don't have the neural aspect or the neuromotor control aspect. Because generally at the muscle level, we create motor units, right, which is a single motor neuron and all of the muscle fibers that neuron innervates. Okay, and then there's a bunch of principles that go along with this in terms of how we recruit muscle tissue. But you can kind of see there that, yes, if we have this bicep, the size or the mass or how much it weighs is some good general indication to how much strength someone might be able to produce. But the actual size of the fibers, in addition to how those fibers are innervated, is more telling of how much force those fibers would be able to produce. So I think this is the kind of the confusing part, and that's why I try to emphasize these definitions, right? Is that how much a muscle weighs, yes, could be correlated to strength, but how much that muscle grows in terms of size of fibers and the cross-sectional area, as well as how that muscle is innervated, is the more telling factor of gains in muscle strength as we look further into the lifespan, particularly around adolescence. So this can get us into our conversation of development of strength, and we'll start in youth. Okay, so usually we see an increase in strength during childhood, and that's for the most part due to an increase in muscle mass from growth processes, right? Just physical growth. We know that children have kind of rapid increases in growth kind of early on in childhood. They plateau a little bit later in childhood, and then they have another rapid increase at adolescence, followed by another plateau after adolescence or into kind of young adulthood, which is what gives us our S-shaped or sigmoid pattern. Okay, so when we see increases in strength, we have this graph over here has a bunch of different exercises and differences between sexes, so boys and girls, right? And we can see that these sex differences are generally minimal until the adolescent period, which is around that 10 to 12 age range, right? But you can see males and females, there's really not much of a difference in their force production, right? Because we have these general increases in growth, okay, overall growth, which is going to mean an overall increase in a person's body weight or a person's body mass. And we can split that mass up into, like our fat-free mass, our fat mass. That fat-free mass can be split up into bone mass, water weight, muscle mass, or lean body mass, right? So if we're increasing in overall mass, we should expect an increase in muscle mass. And that is going to be more or less related to the increases that we see in strength in childhood. However, when we get to puberty, right, I think it was last week, I don't even know what week it is anymore, but when we get to puberty, we know that there are a lot of different hormonal changes that occur, particularly for males, right? We said that when their reproductive systems mature, right, they produce more testosterone, and testosterone promotes anabolic processes, particularly for muscle tissue, right? So in this case, we're going to be kind of pumping that testosterone into the muscle tissue. We're going to be building more muscle tissue, either through hypertrophy or hyperplasia. So either we're making muscle fibers bigger or we're adding more muscle fibers in total, which is going to directly affect muscular strength because men are building muscle just on natural hormonal changes, right? Versus females who don't have the testosterone. Well, I mean, we do produce testosterone, just not as much, right? They do have some hormonal changes, but they're not anabolic or primarily anabolic hormonal changes. So thus they might still experience an increase in strength, but generally it's not going to be as much as men, right? Because they don't have that anabolic process being stimulated by testosterone. And so when we look at these adolescent periods, kind of like from age 12 onward, right, you see that there are these larger gaps. This leg lift between boys and girls is probably the most noticeable gap, right? But we see these larger gaps between the sexes because boys are increasing the size or the cross-sectional area of their muscle, which is going to directly affect their muscle force much more than we see in females. Okay, so those are the hormonal changes that are going to be contributing to strength by directly changing the size of our muscles. But English is hard. There are also neurological changes that occur with physiological maturation. So in terms of our nervous system, we've talked about the structure of neurons, right, and how they have myelin on them. So through physiological maturation, we can increase the amount of myelin on our axons, which we know is kind of a catalyst for signal transmission. So we can increase firing rates and therefore increase our muscle fiber recruitment with more myelin on our neurons. But also we are experiencing more movement patterns, and we become more coordinated in those movement patterns, thus kind of getting to a plasticity effect where we can establish certain activation patterns that are kind of optimizing our muscular activation in terms of either if we're responding to stimuli in the environment, such as like if we have a stretch reflex, or if we're generally voluntarily creating that movement. Okay, so a lot of different things could be contributing, but these are kind of the two primary things that are going to affect strength changes by directly affecting either how our muscles are activated or how much they are growing in size. In terms of strength training, there has been research done that has shown, if we look at this top graph up here, this is a percent increase in strength. And then I know these are hard to read. This came from the book, but we have different individuals that were hooked up to like a dynamometer. I was like, what is the word? They were hooked up to a dynamometer, and so these are looking at like knee flexion, knee extension, elbow flexion, and elbow extension at different speeds. So some of you might be able to see like 30 degrees per second in here, 90 degrees per second, that type of thing. Okay, but this is how we hooked some kids up to a dynamometer. I don't know if you guys have ever been on one, but they're kind of cool. We hooked them up to a dynamometer, kind of set a speed, and then assessed their muscular strength, kind of at a baseline level, trained them, and then looked at the percent increase or decrease that they had based on the strength training that they underwent. Okay, and so the strength-trained individuals you can see are, where's my mouse? Strength-trained individuals are in purple, controls are in a darker purple, so I guess maybe strength-trained we could say is pink, just so. I think they are both shades of purple, but whatever. Okay, so you can see that the percent increase in the strength-trained individuals is much, much, much larger than the control people who had no strength training. Okay, so this kind of points to the fact that involvement in strength training at any age, okay, from childhood to post-adolescence, will kind of help to increase a person's muscle strength. Okay, prepubescent individuals show larger strength gains compared to pubescent and post-pubescent individuals, so that is this second graph down here. Again, we're looking at percent increase in muscular strength. Just to identify the purple bars in this graph are representing our prepubescent individuals, green are our pubescent individuals, and the yellow are the post-pubescent individuals. Okay, so you can see that these purple bars in this graph generally are on the higher side again, for all of these same knee extension, flexion, elbow extension, flexion activities as a result of training, right? So in this one, everybody was trained. But strength gains are larger for the prepubescent individuals than compared to, we've got relatively moderate strength gains for pubescent individuals, which is a little bit more than we see in post-pubescent individuals. So that pre-adolescent, adolescent phase is probably where we're going to have the greatest strength gains in terms of like our youth populations. Increased time of physical activity, however, is going to help with greater strength and bone density. Okay, so we kind of talked about this when we visited our external factors that affect the muscular system. Okay, so you don't necessarily need to train to improve your bone mass or your bone density and your muscle mass. You just need to engage in some type of physical activity. So as long as you're not sedentary, you should have some progress. Okay. Get up and go for a walk or do some squats or something, okay? We've also looked at strength training in terms of low versus high reps and the differences between those. Both of these in research have shown that there are increases in strength. Okay, high rep strength training usually also provides increases in endurance. So any of you fitness buffs know that typically when you do low reps, you do a higher weight. When you do high reps, you do a lower weight, right? So high reps would definitely help with endurance because you are doing more muscular work over a longer period of time, okay? Lower reps, higher weight is going to be more beneficial for gains in power, or kind of the hypertrophy training concept where you're increasing power output overall instead of more on the side of endurance. Both of these are going to increase your strength though. So if that's the goal in youth, then either one is beneficial. Training effects are specific and reversible. So specific in terms of, I've actually just used an example, strength versus power. So specific trainings or specific types of training result in specific results, right? So I'm not super into fitness methods, but I do know that there is a difference between, like, if you look at powerlifting versus, I don't even lift, bro, right? But there are differences in the types of training that you do and how you load your body, how many reps you do compared to other types of training. So, right, that kind of is highlighting the characteristic that training is specific, okay? And how you train is specific to the outcomes that you get. In terms of reversibility, if you stop training, that results in a decrease in strength or an atrophy of your trained muscles, right? Because if your body's like, I have this stress, I have this load on me, I need to respond by building muscle tissue or reinforcing my muscle tissue, reinforcing my bone tissue. If you stop, right, as we see in older adults when they engage in less physical activity, we get a decrease in their overall muscle mass and a decrease in strength usually because they're not using that tissue anymore, and the body kind of sees it as a bit of redundancy, I guess, would be a good word to explain it. So it's like, well, we don't need that tissue. We could probably recycle the protein materials to, reinforce other tissues in the body that might need it more. So training effects are specific and they're reversible. The last thing I wanted to point out is the sex differences post-adolescence, so kind of in that young adulthood to mid-adulthood range. Typically, males have greater strength than females do in terms of their absolute strength. But strength gains as a result of training are fairly equivalent. So if we looked at like how much can I squat compared to my husband, right? I definitely can squat less than he can. But if we went through the same training program, we would likely experience relatively similar strength gains based on the type of training that we engaged in, right? So in with respect to kind of our baseline, if we were normalizing our gains in terms of like a percent increase, okay? Which is why that is the unit that was used in these two graphs, is a percent increase, okay? In terms of development of strength in adulthood, again, males and females have, so same thing that we see just at post-adolescence, so more along the lines of like young adulthood, but as we get into middle adulthood, so think later 20s up to about 50, again, males have greater absolute strength than females do. We also have strength related to specific body regions. So males tend to have more notable differences in the arms and shoulders, and then we have differences in the trunks and legs. Typically, again, overall strength is going to be higher in males versus females, which we can see in the graph on the bottom. So that was a study looking at 3 different visits, okay, and then there's a hip exercise, which is noted by the blue and the purple lines at the bottom, and then they had a trunk or back extension measurement, which is represented by the orange and yellow lines at the top of the graph. Okay, but different strength measurements are specific to different body regions, or we see different patterns in different body regions. But overall, generally, we see that males more absolute strength than females, and that's represented in the graph. Okay, there are also cultural norms to consider. There was a study that looked at repetition of force measurements on individuals that had never participated in strength training before. Okay. Females increased their force production with greater repetitions as compared to males, which is kind of interesting, right? But it kind of points to the impact of environmental factors, because males are more known to engage in strength training compared to females, which I think is changing, right? We're changing the narrative, we're moving forward. I actually am like super encouraged when I go to the gym and I see a lot more females in there, and you see a lot more females engaging in like the free weight areas, which is awesome. Typically when you go in a gym and you see the free weight area, it's all guys, right? So it's just showing that if females engaged in strength training, they too, right, can increase their strength gains. It's just culturally not typically encouraged, but like I said, we are changing things, right? So it's kind of how we encourage males and females to engage in certain types of strength exercising as part of the culture norm, but also it could be the types of jobs that people have, right? So if you think in terms of blue collar jobs or more like physical work jobs, males tend to usually be active in more physical jobs than females do. So if you think about like construction or contracting in terms of building, houses or other businesses, that type of thing, usually those people are males, right? And if you look at a lot of the physical jobs, I mean, even in factory or industrial work, it's usually males doing heavy lifting jobs and whatnot. But also, I actually have an example of gender roles in terms of how different sexes interact with different types of strength-related activities. Is like if my husband and I are coming home from the grocery store and we have this huge grocery bag that holds a lot of stuff, he usually says, I'll get that. Like I'll get that. You get like the box of juice or soda, or like you get the small bag, right? And so it's kind of this, even if we're doing laundry, right, we have 2 laundry baskets, he always picks the heavier one to carry to the car. And I think part of it is like the males are doing the females a service in terms of like, why I'm not going to make you carry the heavy one, right? And it's more of a chivalrous gesture, I think. But at the same time, it's also kind of like demoting in a way. I don't want to say it's negative because I think it comes from a genuine place. Like, I'll get the heavy one. Don't worry about it, you know? But at the same time, it's like, I'm a woman. I'm strong. I might not lift, but I can do it, you know? So I think it's kind of just, it's not encouraged for females to interact with strength-related activities as much as it's encouraged for males to engage in those same activities. Okay, so there was a study that was done in the early 80s that kind of showed that cultural norms were changing in terms of, you know, how we encourage strength-related activities between sexes, and that kind of might impact the differences we see between males and females going, or like kind of moving forward in strength-related research. And the gap is closing. Okay, so with regards to like anticipated familiarity, which is kind of what this test of repetition on force measurements was looking at, but it also looks at kind of how we might be predisposed to perform, or how we're changing in terms of predisposition to perform certain types of activities based on our gender. Okay, so that's a huge external factor that could be affecting strength gains later in adulthood. But also we have to talk about age, right? And how we start to shrivel when we get older. So we know that aging results in a decline in strength, and that's largely going to be greater than the decline in muscle mass. Again, pointing out the difference that muscle mass, although it is related to strength, it is not the primary or determining factor of strength. Remember, strength is going to be primarily based on muscle size and the cross-sectional of a given muscle, not overall muscle mass. So when we look at the effects of aging, it can directly affect the muscular system, or it can affect strength indirectly by affecting other body systems. So in this little schematic over here, we have a decrease in muscle strength, which is kind of the known thing, right? But that decrease in muscle strength could be either our muscle fibers, right? We have changes in muscle fibers and their characteristics, or we have muscle atrophy, okay? Those are direct changes in the muscular system that can occur as a result of aging. But we can also have poor nutrition. If we don't have enough dietary protein, right, then we can't continue to reinforce our muscle tissue or build our muscle tissue. Therefore, we get atrophy and decreases in strength. We know big ticket item for most older adulthood or older adults is that they decrease their physical activity, which can have direct changes to muscle strength, but also could directly affect, you know, their changes in their nervous system, because if they're not using those muscles, those nerve connections in those motor units are going to kind of die off, right? Or maybe we start to lose myelin, perhaps, right? And we don't have as rapid firing, which is going to be directly related to strength. We could also have increases in diseases. We said that the neuromotor control aspect, or the nervous connection between our muscle tissue and our brain, is really important, right? So if we mess with the neurological components in maybe a movement disorder like Parkinson's, Huntington's, or MS, okay, we can disrupt our muscle function or our motor function, which could be directly related to strength. Because again, if we don't use our muscles, they're going to atrophy. Okay, so there's a lot of various things that could be contributing to decreases in muscle strength, other than just aging effects that naturally occur in the muscular system. Adults of all ages have been shown to increase strength with resistance training. So again, it's kind of that if you participate in physical activity, you're doing more good than not participating in physical activity. So there have been some studies that have looked at strength gains at different percentages of a person's 1RM. So if we look kind of at the younger middle adulthood end of the spectrum, we see strength gains as a result of hypertrophic effects from training, which generally requires that we have a workload of about 80 to 85%. of our 1RM. So higher intensity strength training, right? But in older adults, right, we still see an increase in muscle mass and strength at a fairly lower or moderate workload at about 60 to 80% of their 1 rep max. Okay. Generally, older adults have more restrictions on their training regimen based on pre-existing health conditions, right? So if they have a heart condition or if they have osteoporosis and, you know, their bones are brittle, maybe they need to work at lower weight, higher rep, right? But that generally we see it kind of regardless of the age, we can still see increases in strength, right? Even at these different percentages between moderate and high. So there are benefits for all ages. Okay, most strength gains, or if you're doing strength maintenance, are going to be due to improved neurological function. So again, the more you move, the more you're constantly stimulating those nervous connections with your muscle, the healthier your nerves stay, the more your muscles are going to be activated, right? And the more that they can maintain their structural integrity as well as how much force they can put out.